One cold Castilian night, under a moonless sky, a woman walked beside a wooden coffin. Her royal garments soaked with damp earth, her eyes wide and hollow, she whispered not to the priests, not to her guards, but to the rotting corpse inside that box. The coffin held the body of her husband, dead for weeks, yet she refused to bury him. She slept beside him, spoke to him, guarded him like a holy relic, and she was not some forgotten commoner lost to grief. She was Queen Juana of Castile, daughter of the most powerful monarchs in Spain's history, wife of a European prince, heir to the largest empire in Christendom, but power did not protect her from madness. Or perhaps it wasn't madness at all. Perhaps it was a woman crushed between politics, obsession, and betrayal. History would call her Juana la Loca, Juana the Mad. But what they forget is that this story was never just about a woman's broken mind. It was about a kingdom willing to silence its queen, about a father who stole her crown, about a son who locked her away for life, and about the slow, quiet execution of a soul through isolation, humiliation, and grief. Some say she was dangerous, others say she was inconvenient, but one truth remains: the moment she loved too deeply, the world began to pull her apart, not with swords, not with fire, but with silence, rumors, and cold stone walls. And long before the coffin appeared, before the corpse, before the whispered prayers in the dark, there was a birth. A child born not just of royal blood, but of two crowns that would one day fracture. A girl destined for history, not because of what she conquered, but because of how she broke. Because to understand why Juana walked beside the dead, we have to start with the moment she opened her eyes inside a palace built on unity and fear. Juana was never meant to rule. That was the tragedy from the start. In a royal court where ambition was currency and bloodlines were weapons, she was born into glory, but never groomed for the weight of a crown. Her mother was Queen Isabella of Castile, the Iron Matriarch who crushed rebellions and launched the Reconquista. Her father was King Ferdinand of Aragon, a calculating political master who unified Spain not through peace, but through power. Together, they were the Catholic monarchs, a title forged in crusades and political marriage. They were Europe's most formidable duo, and Juana was their third child. She was quiet, bookish, deeply religious, sensitive in a way her mother saw as weakness. Unlike her older siblings, Juana showed little appetite for conquest or governance, but Isabella demanded discipline. She sent her daughter to study Latin, theology, court etiquette, because in this family, even the gentle had to be sharp. And yet, no matter how much she learned, Juana never quite fit the mold. There were whispers at court of her melancholy moods, her strange silences, her intense eyes that lingered too long on passing shadows. One ambassador would later write that she possessed a heart too deep for this world. Others weren't so kind, they simply called her fragile, but dynastic marriages rarely cared for temperament. When Juana was 16, her fate was sealed. She was promised to Philip of Burgundy, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor. A Habsburg prince, handsome, clever, and dangerous. The union was strategic, a bridge between Spain and the sprawling imperial ambitions of the Habsburgs. A match made not in heaven, but in a chessboard soaked with ink and ambition. Juana never had a say. There's no record of protest, no scandal, no refusal. She obeyed, as royal daughters were expected to do, but deep down something began to harden. The girl raised in palaces now prepared to be exported like an artifact to a foreign land, a foreign court, a foreign husband. And so, in the year 1496, Juana left Spain behind. Her mother kissed her farewell not as a daughter, but as a pawn well played. Her father offered no comfort, only instruction. Honor your house, bear sons, serve the empire. She boarded the ship to Flanders not knowing that love would undo her. That grief would hollow her, that she would return to Spain years later, dragging the corpse of that same husband through the countryside. But that moment was still far off. For now, there was only wind, sea, and the face of a stranger waiting for her in Burgundy. And he was beautiful. He wasn't what she expected. He was more. Philip of Burgundy, tall, golden-haired, with the kind of beauty that made courtiers hush when he entered the room. Juana had been warned he was proud, even vain. But when she saw him for the first time, she didn't see politics. She saw fire. He kissed her before protocol allowed, breaking etiquette with a smirk. She fell instantly, not in the manner of queens, but of teenagers, of poets, of doomed women, and for a time Philip returned her affection. There were feasts, dances, whispered laughter behind chamber doors. Juana, for the first time in her life, bloomed. Away from her mother's cold perfectionism, her father's calculations, she was finally wanted. And she gave herself to Philip with total devotion, not just her body, but her soul. She loved him recklessly, entirely. In public and in private, it was not the reserved affection expected of a queen. It was obsession, pure and raw, and it terrified those around her. But Philip was not like her. His passion was seasonal, political. He had mistresses before Juana, and he would have more after. He enjoyed her devotion, perhaps even fed on it, but he did not return it with the same hunger. Within months, the signs appeared. Long absences, secret conversations. Court women lingering too long in his gaze, and Juana, already fragile, already intense, began to crack. She accused maids of seduction. She pulled one woman by the hair and cut it off herself. She screamed behind closed doors. She prayed obsessively, then raged when no comfort came. Philip, ever the charmer, dismissed it as female hysteria. But what looked like madness was grief in slow motion. She was losing him, not to death, but to indifference. And that for Juana was worse. The court began to whisper. La Loca, some said behind her back, the mad one, but it wasn't madness yet. It was heartbreak, raw and public and unfiltered. And in the cold halls of Burgundy, heartbreak was unbecoming of a queen. She bore children, 6 in total, including the future Emperor Charles, but no child could fill the void Philip carved into her. And through it all, she kept loving him. That was her most dangerous trait. She never stopped. When her mother Isabella died in 1504, Juana became Queen of Castile, but she was not welcomed home with joy. Spain was suspicious, Burgundy was hostile, Philip wanted power, and Juana just wanted him to love her again, but he didn't, he never would, and soon he would vanish altogether, not to another mistress, but to the grave. It wasn't the betrayal that broke her, it was the silence that followed. In the summer of 1506, Philip the Handsome collapsed after drinking cold water following a strenuous game of ball. Within days, he was dead. Just 28 years old. The doctors called it fever. The court called it divine punishment. Joanna called it murder, and she meant it. She believed her father, Ferdinand II, had poisoned Philip to seize back control of Castile. After all, Joanna had inherited the throne of Castile 2 years earlier when Queen Isabella died, and Philip had immediately styled himself King of Castile, pushing his wife to the background. He craved power, and Castile was a crown too heavy to share. Joanna's father hated it. Philip's death, in this context, felt too convenient, too perfect, and for Joanna, already unsteady, it was too much. She did not weep publicly. She did not scream. Instead, she stared at his corpse for hours, then days, then refused to bury him. She ordered the body embalmed, preserved, kept near. She would not part with him, not now, not ever. To everyone else, Philip was gone. To Joanna, he had simply entered a deeper sleep, one that she alone could guard. When courtiers urged her to hold a funeral, she lashed out. She accused the clergy of plotting to steal his body. She demanded the guards sleep near the coffin. She insisted his chamber remain untouched. She still spoke to him at night, sometimes lovingly, sometimes furiously, like a wife quarreling with a husband who had only just stepped out. The rot had begun, but she refused to see it. And it was here in the stillness of a stone palace filled with the scent of death, that Joanna passed the threshold between sorrow and something far more dangerous. This was not simple grief. This was fixation. She refused to be apart from him, even in decay. And the court, already uneasy with her volatility, now looked upon her with dread. Even in this state, Joanna was technically queen. She still held the crown of Castile, but every day that passed beside the corpse was a day her enemies gained ground. Her father, her nobles, her advisors. They began whispering, not only was she unsuitable, she was unwell. And the worst part, her unwavering love, the very thing that made her human, was the same thing now used to deem her inhuman. The queen was unraveling, and Spain, hungry for order, began preparing to take everything from her. But Joanna would not sit still. She had one last request: to bury Philip herself in a place of her choosing, far from schemers and liars. And so, under her command, a funeral procession began, not to bury her husband, but to carry him, preserved, unburied, across the heart of Castile. No funeral, no burial, just a coffin that moved, at night, carried by guards who were forbidden to speak of what they saw. In the months following Philip's death, Queen Joanna ordered his embalmed corpse placed in a sealed casket and began a dark journey across Castile. But this was no state procession. There were no banners, no hymns, no priests, only silence, torchlight, and the lingering scent of decay. Each night, the coffin was loaded onto a mule-drawn cart. Each morning, it was hidden from view. The queen, disheveled, sleep-deprived, and growing more gaunt by the day, walked or rode beside it. Sometimes she demanded it be opened. Sometimes she whispered to it. Sometimes she wept. But what she never did was let go. She claimed to be searching for the perfect place to bury her husband. But every time they approached a monastery, she refused. Too many women there, she would mutter. She feared they would gaze upon Philip's body and desire him, even in death. She banned all nuns from coming near the coffin. She once diverted the entire caravan away from a convent she had originally chosen, because she dreamed, the night before, that one of the sisters had kissed his corpse. It was not madness in the way her enemies hoped. It was loyalty gone feral, love that had become rot, and beneath it all was fear. If she buried him, she would lose him forever. In some twisted way, this journey was her final protest against death, against betrayal, against a world that had stripped her of control. But Spain was watching. The nobles were embarrassed. The clergy was appalled. And her father, Ferdinand II, was growing impatient. Joanna's actions gave him everything he needed: justification. He began quietly petitioning for control, painting her as unfit to rule. A woman in mourning was one thing. A woman carrying a corpse across the kingdom was something else entirely. Despite everything, Joanna still wore her crown. Technically, she remained Queen of Castile. The men who planned to remove her had to tread carefully. Appearances mattered. They would not dethrone her with swords. They would use pity. They would use whispers. And above all, they would use her love against her. By early 1507, the procession had lasted so long that even Joanna's most loyal attendants began to crack. Some resigned, some begged to return to court, others simply disappeared in the night. And still, the queen walked on, withered, obsessed, eternal in her grief. But the road was running out. Her father had returned to Castile. And this time, he wasn't coming to console her. He was coming to take her crown. He didn't come to mourn, he came to clean up. When Ferdinand II returned to Castile in 1507, he didn't arrive as a grieving father, but as a tactician surveying a battlefield. His daughter, the Queen, was wandering the countryside with a corpse. His son-in-law, the man who tried to seize Castile from him, was dead, and the throne now stood dangerously exposed. This was not a moment for compassion. It was an opportunity. Ferdinand met Joanna in person. The stories were true. She looked half dead herself, emaciated, sleepless, still speaking of Philip as if he had simply gone silent, not rotted. But when he asked her to return to court, she refused. She didn't trust him. She didn't trust anyone. She clung to the coffin like a relic of her only real power, love. Ferdinand didn't beg. He didn't threaten. He simply declared publicly that Joanna was unfit to rule. Not deposed, no, that would be illegal. She remained queen in name, but he named himself regent, claiming she was mentally incapable of governance. And the nobles, exhausted by her displays of grief, agreed. Just like that, the crown slipped from her fingers, not by force, but by silence. He ordered her moved to the fortress of Tordesillas, a medieval stronghold turned personal prison. The coffin followed, but now it was closed permanently. Guards were posted not to protect her, but to contain her. She was 28 years old, still young, still royal, but now a prisoner of her own father. The woman whose bloodline ruled half of Spain, the daughter of Isabella the Catholic, the rightful Queen of Castile, was locked away by a man who claimed to love her, not because she rebelled, not because she plotted, but because she felt too deeply, too publicly, too inconveniently. There were no trials, no decrees of treason, just a slow suffocation in stone walls. Ferdinand ensured that messengers stopped visiting, letters vanished, and the outside world gradually stopped asking what had happened to Joanna. Her name became a whisper, La Loca, a cautionary tale, a footnote, and behind the thick walls of Tordesillas, Joanna waited, days blurred into months, months into years. But she held on to one final belief: that someone someday would let her out, that her father's grip would loosen, that her son, Charles, the child she bore for the empire, would return to save her. She was wrong. The door did not slam, it simply closed and never opened again. Juana was confined to the fortress of Tordesillas in 1509. She would die there in 1555. For 46 years, the Queen of Castile lived behind stone walls, with no trial, no sentence, and no future. The world moved on without her. Spain expanded across the oceans. The Habsburg Empire grew richer, stronger. Her father, Ferdinand II, died in comfort, and still Juana remained unchanged, unmoved, unburied. Her chambers were sparse, a single window, no throne, no mirror. They feared mirrors might remind her of what she once was. Her meals were plain, her guards rotated often, most could not bear the assignment for long. Some said she rarely spoke. Others said she wept when the wind blew a certain way. But no one ever claimed she forgot. She knew who she was. She knew what had been taken. For years she asked to see her children. They never came. She begged to leave the fortress. The requests were filed, ignored, buried. She clung to prayer, then abandoned it. She whispered to herself, then fell silent. Time, at some point, ceased to mean anything. She was not a prisoner of war, nor a criminal. She was simply a woman history no longer wanted. Once, a visiting priest asked her if she still believed she was queen. Juana looked him in the eyes and said, "I am." And then, almost tenderly, "But it means nothing now." Years passed, her body weakened, her hair turned white, but her title, Queen of Castile, was never revoked. She remained sovereign in name only, a legal ghost haunting her own country. And then, long after her father died, her son returned to Spain. Charles, now the most powerful man in Europe, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. King of Spain, Juana's son, he arrived in Tordesillas with the full weight of the crown behind him. She thought he had come to free her. He had not. She had waited for him for decades. Juana believed that one day her son Charles, the boy she bore during her brief years of love, would return not as an emperor, but as a son. And in 1520 he did. But not to open her doors. He came to seal them tighter. Charles V had inherited everything. Spain, Naples, the Low Countries, the Holy Roman Empire. His empire stretched from Germany to the Americas. But empires are not built on sentiment. And Charles, though he bowed before his mother and kissed her hand, had no intention of restoring her to power or even to daylight. He examined her condition, or so he claimed. He noted her silences, her muttering prayers, her fear of mirrors and windows, and then he signed the orders to continue her confinement. The queen remained in her fortress, and her son, the last thread of hope she had, became her final jailer. He justified it as necessity, that Spain needed stability, that rumors of her instability might undermine the crown. And so the woman who gave birth to an emperor became an administrative risk to be managed and forgotten. He called her mad, but he never asked what had made her that way. The visits became less frequent, then stopped altogether. Juana was left with a few handmaids, a priest, and the hollow sound of wind in the corridors. Her body bent with time. She suffered joint pain, chronic fevers, swelling. Some days she could not walk. Others she refused to speak. But even in her weakest moments, When servants whispered prayers over her frail form, she refused to say that she was not queen. She still wore her title like a crown no one could steal, even if no one ever saw it. Years later, when Charles spoke of his mother, he did so with a detached reverence. He never slandered her, he did not mock her. But he never released her either, because in the ledger of kingship, love had no place beside power. And so Juana waited, not for escape now, but for silence to end. She died the way she lived, surrounded by stone, watched by silence, and untouched by freedom. On April 12, 1555, at the age of 75, Juana of Castile took her final breath inside the fortress of Tordesillas. There was no grand procession, no court in mourning, no foreign emissaries kneeling before her casket, just a quiet death in a quiet cell, unfit even for the queen she still was. Her health had crumbled slowly. For years she had been unable to walk, her legs inflamed and twisted. Her voice had become a whisper, rarely heard and often ignored. She spoke to no one in her final weeks, save for an old priest who claimed she wept while he recited the Psalms. But even as her body failed, her mind did not fade the way her captors had long claimed. In moments of lucidity, she still remembered every betrayal, every silence, every door that never opened. She was buried beside Philip, the man whose death had broken her and whose love had never truly belonged to her. Their coffins lay in the royal chapel of Granada, beneath marble and dust. But for 49 years, she had slept in life before she ever reached death. Juana had not ruled, she had not led armies or signed treaties, but her tragedy ruled the court. Her silence echoed louder than proclamations, and her absence shaped the crown more than her presence ever could. Her name, Juana la Loca, would become legend, a woman too mad to rule, too dangerous to free. But the truth was far colder. She was a queen sacrificed not to madness, but to convenience. Centuries later, historians would reopen her story and find not a lunatic, but a prisoner, not a madwoman, but a monarch exiled by her own blood. A woman who loved too deeply, hurt too visibly, and paid the price for being too human in a world that demanded perfect masks. Juana of Castile never led an army, she never passed laws, she never ruled with an iron hand, but she was still a queen, and somehow that made her dangerous, not because of what she did, but because of how she suffered, how visibly, how inconveniently. And for a world built on masks, there is nothing more threatening than a royal who refuses to hide her pain. History called her mad, but madness is easy to name when it's wrapped in silk and locked behind stone. Maybe she was broken, maybe she was, but what's certain is this: her cage was built not from iron, but from inheritance, expectation, and silence. And she wasn't the only one. In another kingdom, a French king wandered his palace, convinced he was made of glass. In Bohemia, another monarch screamed at his own coronation and drank himself into exile. Power doesn't shield the mind. Sometimes it tears it apart. If you want to understand how madness twisted the crown across Europe, watch the stories of those two kings next. Their minds cracked in public, and their thrones did too. And if Juana's tragedy left you thinking, tell us. Not every story needs a reply. Some just need to be heard. We'll meet you again on the next descent into royal ruin.